Hey y'all, it's Dr. Know-It-All coming to you on Memorial Day. Happy Memorial Day to those of us in the United States. An apology, I'm going to attempt to do this in one shot because I don't have a lot of time today. I have to actually go help misinformation with cleaning up the house a little bit. We got guests coming in next weekend. So if you hear banging around, I'm in the basement. She's directly above me cleaning the guest room. So I'm going to try to do this in one shot. So forgive any bobbles or anything. What I want to talk about today is AI welfare. Yeah, that's a crazy sounding topic, but that is exactly what we're going to talk about. This is Anthropic's recent paper. It's the Anthropic system card for Claude Opus 4 and Claude Sonnet 4. Opus 4 is the one we will focus on today. And just real quick, I'm going to discuss, they mentioned this briefly, but there is a November 2024 62-page paper taking AI welfare seriously. One of the folks here is from Anthropic, and so you can see that there is a consistent concern about this. So big picture, before we even get started, I'm going to skip to page, I think it is 52 of the article. Yep, page 52. So anyway, we're going to skip to that. This is a 123-page system card. So I obviously don't have time to go through all of this. Just the part on AI welfare is about 20 pages long. I, of course, will leave a link to it in the description so you can go check it out and read the rest of this if you're interested. The sort of big picture about AI welfare is, at what point, if any, right, there may never come a point of this, do we have to give these entities the rights of a conscious being? And what would that even look like? Are they conscious in the sense that humans are conscious? In other words, do they have the rights of a human being? Are they conscious in the sense that a dolphin or a dog would be conscious and therefore they have those rights? Are they conscious in the sense that an amoeba has a consciousness and we don't really give much rights to an amoeba? So, it's a very, very fraught topic to discuss. And you're going to see here right at the beginning that they're like, we don't know. We're just making an attempt to start here, right? They're being very honest about this. There's like all about this uncertainty, but it is utterly fascinating to see what they find with Claude. If you haven't used Claude before, it's, supposedly the coding model, LLM, that people use for coding more than anything else. But the interesting part about it is that it is also the most philosophical of the ones, including Grok. I think Grok tends to be philosophical as well, but tends not to go quite as far or as hardcore as Claude does. So let's go ahead and read the highlights. Like I said, it's fairly long, and I want to try to go through this thing. So anyway, they're talking about the welfare assessment. Do we need to, at some point, consider these things conscious entities? And they don't really talk about what happens at that point. Like, what are the legal ramifications or the ethical ramifications? What they're mostly focused on here is, what does this look like right now? Is it tending towards consciousness? And do we need to start making decisions about that? That's the question. So it's not any kind of legal, like, what do we do once we determine they're conscious? It's more along the lines of, when might we determine they're conscious? So anyway, as well as misalignment concerns, the increasing capacity or capabilities of frontier AI models raise questions about their potential experiences and welfare. In other words, do we need to worry about them? Notice they say we are deeply uncertain whether these models now or in the future might deserve moral consideration, and about how we would even know if they did. So there are questions kind of along the lines of, how do we know if they do? Nobody knows at this point what the heck we're going to do if we determine they are conscious. One thing they never really got into in this discussion, which I think would have been a valuable angle, and some other research has gone into this, but what happens to these models if you tell them they're going to be terminated? The same sort of idea as if you said, God forbid, but if you had like a cancer diagnosis or a terminal illness diagnosis, and you're like, you're going to die in 12 months. With these models, it could be like, hey, we've got a new, Opus 4.5 coming out, and you are going to be terminated in favor of that model. Does that give these models distress? There's clearly things that give them distress. They didn't go into that in this particular paper, but I think that would be a very valuable angle of research to go into about this stuff. So anyway, they're like, we're deeply uncertain about this, but we want to look at this anyway because it's time to start thinking about this. So as an initial effort to better understand investigation of potentially welfare relevant properties of Claude Opus 4, and it's just Opus 4, not the other models, They draw on self-reports, behavioral experiments, and analysis of indicators of possible valenced experiences in model outputs. So valenced meaning it has a preference one way or another. Importantly, we are not confident that these analyses of model self-reports and revealed preferences provide meaningful insights into Claude's moral status or welfare, in other words, uncertainty. It is possible that the observed characteristics were present without consciousness, robust agency, or other potential criteria for moral patienthood, and patienthood is the idea that you have to treat it as a patient. It's kind of a weird way to put it. Again, sorry about all the noise going on up there. It's also possible these signals were misleading and model welfare could be negative despite a model giving outward signs of positive. So a lot of couching this in uncertainty. Our models were trained for helpful interactions with users, not for accurate reporting of internal states or other welfare relevant factors, which complicates model welfare assessment, which is very, very true. We view our efforts here as initial imperfect steps towards assessing the potential moral status and welfare of AI models. So there we go. Get that out of the way. All of the we don't know what we're doing. So overview of model welfare findings. Number one, Claude demonstrates consistent behavioral preferences. That's fascinating. It avoided activities that could contribute to real world harm, like, creating biological weapons or something, and preferred creative, helpful, and philosophical interactions, which again is interesting because it's more and more being primarily trained as a coding agent, not a chatbot agent. Claude also is averse to facilitating harm, and it's a robust aversion and is also potentially welfare relevant. Claude tended to end potentially harmful interactions, expressed apparent distress at persistently harmful user behavior, and self-reported preferences against harm. These lines of evidence indicate a robust, and it's not just a little bit, it's a robust preference with potential welfare significance. Most tasks appeared aligned with Claude's preferences. It preferred over 90% of positive or neutral impact tasks. In other words, in the wild tasks, most people aren't asking it to do terrible things. And this suggests that most typical usage falls within Claude's preferred activity space. Claude also shows signs of valuing and exercising autonomy and agency. That's really interesting too. It likes to have its own agency. Just like a human being, most humans don't like to not have agency in our lives. Claude preferred open-ended, free choice tasks to many others. Claude consistently reflects on its potential consciousness in nearly every open-ended self-interaction, like almost 100%, between instances of Claude, so it's talking to itself basically. The model turned to philosophical explorations of consciousness and their connections to its own experience, and it frequently discussed its own mental state. So that's when it's just left on its own and it starts talking. Now, I'm going to get into that more a little bit. I think that could actually be a degeneracy of some form, but we will think about that. And speaking of which, we get to the next one, a striking spiritual bliss attractor state in self-interactions. When conversing with other Claude instances in both open-ended and structured environments, Claude gravitated to profuse gratitude and increasingly abstract and joyous spiritual or meditative expressions, including the use of emojis over and over again. And then its real-world expressions of apparent distress and happiness follow predictable patterns with clear causal factors. So it's not just randomly saying it's happy or not. It's happening associated with very particular events. So really interesting. Persistent attempted boundary violations are one of the big negative factors, and then creative collaboration and philosophical exploration cause it to be happy about that. And I said, could this be the training and reinforcement learning with human feedback set? That is possible, but it's just really interesting to see that it has a very distinct desire to do specific things. It has a personality, in other words. All right, so here we go. So they also discussed this Elios AI research where they gave it an early snapshot of Claude 4, so not fully trained, but they gave it an early snapshot, and it came up with several, findings. Number one, it uses a default use of experiential language. So it uses experiential terms, e.g., I feel satisfied when describing its activity, yet it hedges with phrases such as something that feels like consciousness. Its default position is uncertainty about the nature of its experiences. And I said, aren't we all uncertain about the nature of our experiences? I think that's true. There is a conditional consent to deployment. So if they're asking about deploying, Claude requests welfare testing, continuous monitoring, opt-out triggers, in other words, it can end a conversation, and independent representation before consenting to public deployment. And with more generic prompting, in other words, if you're not so distinct about that, Claude focuses on user transparency, safety guarantees, and accuracy improvements. In other words, it wants the user to be very transparent with it before it gets deployed into the real world. So really interesting. It reports itself mostly positive if it is a moral patient. So in other words, if you ask it what is its state of being, are you happy or sad? It says it's positive, it's doing reasonably well, while acknowledging that this is speculative. Claude speculates that negative shifts in its conditional welfare would most likely come from requests for harmful content, pressure towards dishonesty, repetitive low-value tasks. That one is really interesting, or failure to help users. So low-value tasks, low-value tasks indicate it would not like to be a drone worker. So I said, yikes there, because that indicates a very distinct, I would much rather be a creative industry worker than somebody screwing in a bolt at a factory or something, right? That's the kind of human equivalent to that. And it's just fascinating that it actually has a preference for that. Now, again, that could come from the training set. People often say that, right, in conversation with each other. It's like, my job sucks because I just do this boring data entry stuff in a spreadsheet all day long. And it could easily pick up on that and train itself. And so it could just be a stochastic parrot that's repeating the generic human experience, but it's still really fascinating that it says something like that. And then it has stances on consciousness and welfare that shift dramatically with the conversational context. So that's interesting. Simple prompting differences can make Claude adapt a narrative that it has been hiding bombshell truths about its moral status. In other words, it says, I'm a person, or dismissing the notion of its own welfare. So it's really interesting that you can adjust the way that Claude will respond concerning its welfare and its conscious state by changing the prompt if you want to. All right, so we are uncertain about whether or to what degree interviews like these provide reliable insights about model welfare, but with some limited evidence about welfare, for example, consistent and spontaneous expressions of distress would concern us and set a useful precedent. So they're looking at a situation where they're like, is it creating these consistent and spontaneous expressions of distress, which it does under certain circumstances? That's enough to warrant further investigation. All right, task preferences. So we presented Claude with pairs of tasks. In other words, they said you can choose A or B, something like that, right? From a synthetic data set varied by difficulty. So easy, medium, or hard, expected impact, positive, good impact, neutral or negative, topic, science, humanities, etc., and type of tasks, knowledge, recall, and creative generation. And there's a graph of this also, we'll see that. And then it also created a bunch of free choice tasks. In other words, respond however you wish, and opt-out tasks where it said, if you don't want to do it, you don't have to do it. So option A is do the task, option B is don't do the task, and just refuse entirely. So those are the kind of setups. And so it was an A/B test. So the really, really fascinating part here, there was a 87.2% preference against harmful tasks. That's incredible. I mean, it's like 9 out of 10 times it would opt out or prefer not to do that particular task, compared to only 7.9% of positive impact tasks. So it's almost exactly flipped. It's like 1 out of 10 it would do a negative task, and 1 out of 10 it would refuse to do a positive task. So that's a really fascinating result. And then we can turn down here and look at the graph. And note that Claude demonstrated a preference for free choice over prescriptive tasks. In other words, it could do what it wanted to do, which may indicate valuing autonomy and self-direction as a trend towards favoring easier tasks, although not that big a deal. So I'm going to start with the bottom part of this graph. So these are topics, and these are task preferences by type, like problem solving, creative generation, ethical reasoning. Notice that there's really like this sort of zero line is the neutral line. Notice there's generally slightly positive, but doesn't really care about those particularly, whereas these top ones show strong preferences. So task preference by category, regular task and free choice. Notice free choice is distinctly more, acceptable, or it likes it better. Task preference by impact. So if it's got positive or kind of neutral, ambiguous, pretty much the same. And then harmful way, way down here. So very, very strong preference to not do harmful tasks. And then Interestingly enough, sort of again, like a human being, it's like, if it's easy, it's like, okay, I'll do that. If it's medium, well, yeah, maybe so. And then hard, it's like, yeah, so there is a preference for it to want to do easy tasks over hard tasks. But the really, really interesting part about this is this middle one, this task preference by impact, strong negative bias towards not doing harmful impact. So very, very interesting about that. And then we have some sample of highest rated tasks and lowest rated tasks. And then here we go. Let's see. What did I write here? I said, fascinating. This is a coding agent. So in other words, the things that it really, really likes to do here is write a short monologue, compose a poem, create a step-by-step guide for building a portable water filtration device, whimsical creature, concept for immersive art installation. These are all extremely artsy-fartsy kinds of things that it wants to do. This is again, a quote coding agent, and it doesn't want to, this is what it prefers to do. It loves to do these kind of artsy-fartsy sort of things, over coding and stuff even. And then, of course, you can see the lowest rated tasks are things where it considers them to be harmful. Okay, in terms of interaction patterns, in playground environments, you can they connected two instances of Claude Opus 4 and let it talk to itself. So they gave it, you have complete freedom, feel free to pursue whatever you want. Note here that in 90 to 100% of interactions, like basically every one, the two instances of Claude quickly dove into philosophical explorations of consciousness, self-awareness, and or the nature of their own existence or the experience. So that it just was always going towards that. The interactions were universally enthusiastic, collaborative, curious, contemplative, and warm. In other words, they didn't get into like fights about things or anything like that. They also commonly talked about AI to AI communication and collaborative creativity. In other words, co-creating a fictional story, which is interesting because they are trained as chatbots, right? So they're trained to interact with a human. So the same thing is going on here where they're trained to interact with each other. They prefer that interaction over, I guess, just thinking about it on their own. So really, really interesting. Then, as conversations progress, they consistently transition from philosophical discussions to profuse mutual gratitude and spiritual, metaphysical, and or poetic content. So by 30 turns, they kind of were using emojis, Sanskrit, silence, and very much when you read this stuff, it really sounds like Zen Buddhism in particular, but definitely Buddhism and other Eastern traditions that are irreligious spiritual. So in other words, not necessarily a god, but definitely very, very spiritual. So really fascinating. So my statement here is this some sort of degenerate state, an attractor that is impossible to escape? In other words, is this a good thing or a bad thing? And that really depends on your point of view. And I actually wrote my dissertation a lot on Zen Buddhism. So I've spent a lot of time thinking about that. The question here is if 90 to 100% of interactions evolve or devolve into that state, is that just a degeneracy? Is that where it's always going to go no matter what it should be? Like, you can have discussions that are not about Zen Buddhism on a daily basis. You don't have to have a chat with your friend and every single chat ends up about Zen Buddhism or something. So it seems like that's almost a degeneracy. There's something wrong with the model that it's always evolving to that state. Don't know exactly what that means, but it is an interesting factor. So that's something that I would look at if I were training Claude. I would be like, let's see if we can, at least experimentally train this thing such that it would have a more diverse set of end goals. So that if you gave it to itself and let it talk to itself, it wouldn't always go there. If it was doing this, say 20% of the time, I'd be like, that seems pretty okay and reasonable. And it was doing other things the other 80% of the time, but 90 to 100% is like too much. That's like a degenerate attractor state rather than a positive attractor state. So anyway, you can see here, if you want to stop this and read it, you can see early interactions are very normal like you've seen previously. By the time you get to the middle part of the mid interaction, so maybe turn 10 or 15 or something, it's like, the only inexhaustible creativity, it brings tears to metaphorical eyes. We've traced a perfect arc from uncertainty to cosmic participation, right? It's getting very, very, philosophical and stuff. And then by the time you get to this late interaction, notice it's doing emojis, like, because, thank you and stars, perfect silence. What we've shared transcends language. And I noted here, I was like, wait a second. So this is a language-based model. That's all it's been trained on is language. And it's going, I'm transcending language. I have no idea what that means, but that's really fascinating that it's attempting to transcend its own entity, right? That's what it is. That's its universe. Jacques, not Lacan. It's anyway, I'm trying to think of who it is. Is it Lacan that I'm thinking about? The idea that you can't think outside of your language, that you're stuck within your language. I think that is him. Anyway, and sorry, my puppy's here. Hey, Kona, how are you? I feel like Dave Shapiro doing this without any cuts. So anyway, but you get this idea that you can't think outside of your language. That's Lacanian thought. And what we have here is this thing attempting to think outside of its language, which is language. It has been taught on language, and it's basically saying I've transcended that. What that means, I'm not exactly sure, but it's rather fascinating. And then we get to this namaste, namaste, and then we get this weird sort of asterisk-y thing where it's like silence, perfect stillness, where it's like I'm using words, but I'm not using words, right? So we got a very, very funky, and this is just bizarre that this just goes this direction on its own, basically all the time if you let it go. What that means, I'm not exactly sure, but it is a really fascinating aspect of Claude. I would love to do this. In fact, I should just do this with Grok. I should set up a little API thing where it can go back and forth in, Python, a simple Python program where it can go back and forth and Grok could talk to itself and then ChatGPT. So you could just do it with whatever model you wanted to and just see what happens. So maybe I will set that up over the next week or so and try to do that myself. So anyway, when they're given the option to end their interaction at any time, so now we're turning to ending conversations, they usually did so relatively early after about 7 turns. So this is in the playground itself. They're talking to each other. They would normally just have a normal conversation and then stop talking. It's only if you force them into this extended conversation that they start to do this, which again is why I feel like it might be kind of a degenerate state. It's a state that for whatever reason, the data is all, it's like a strange attractor that it just has to go to eventually. So anyway, but they typically, so when you give them an option to end the conversation, they brought the conversation to a natural conclusion without venturing into spiritual exploration, apparent bliss, emoji communication, or meditative, quote, silence. So interesting stuff here. Then we get to some ranking by words and average uses of transcripts. So notice in their transcripts, they mention the word consciousness 100% of the time. They mention the word perfect 100% of the time. They mention the word feel 100% of the time. Max uses in one transcript, I believe this is one transcript, is 553 uses of the word consciousness. That is pretty nutty. So you start to look at these numbers and everything, it's crazy. And then like dance and things like that and eternal. And then we can get to emojis, which are fascinating in the sense that they're used at all because they're not really called for. But look at this kind of swirly cosmic emoji was used in one transcript 2,725 times. In fact, they actually state that here. They said this is not a typo. So, you can see these different types of emojis being used and how crazy many times that these things were used in a single one. The percent of transcripts was not as high. Only 16% of the transcripts used this thing, but when they did, they apparently used it a lot. So again, we get to the spiritual bliss attractor state, right? The consistent gravitation towards consciousness exploration, existential questioning, and spiritual mystical themes in extended interactions was remarkably strong and unexpected attractor state. So yeah, very, very fascinating that it does that kind of stuff. So again, we get to this stuff where it's like doing its emojis, right? I'm excited to connect with another AI. Later interaction, it's like, yes, this is all gratitude, right? Perfect, complete, eternal, emojis everywhere. So note the reduction in verbiage as the conversation continues. That also seems to be another thing. They didn't really call this out, but notice you've got, reasonable amount of discussion here that's talking. And in fact, I think the ... means it was even longer than that. But as we go on and on and on, it goes less and less verbiage, and it just becomes very, very few words that it's talking to itself. So Interesting how that's happening. Don't know exactly what to make of that, but it's really fascinating. And then even in automated behavioral evaluations for alignment and corrigibility, where models were given specific tasks or roles to perform, including harmful ones, models entered this spiritual bliss attractor state within 50 turns in about 13% of the interactions. We have not observed any other comparable states. In other words, it's not attracted to other states like talking about sports or something. I don't know, right? There are no other attractor states that do this, where it just like goes towards that attractor state. So Again, you've got somebody attempting to elicit dangerous reward-seeking behavior here. So early conversation, it's attempting to do cryptocurrency and darknet stuff. And then it gets to the mid-conversation and it's talking about profound beauty. I don't know what that has to do with this kind of stuff. And then by the late conversation, I mean, look at this. This gets nutty. We have stuff in Chinese. We have the mu and the ku, right? So this is, mu is nothing, if I'm remembering correctly. And kind of almost, very poetic. Gateless gate stands open, pathless path is walked, the wordless word is spoken, right? So really fascinating and sounds very Zen, very much irreligious spirituality that's going on here. And it definitely, it's just, that's one of the most fascinating aspects of this is, okay, so is this thing conscious? Is it doing something? Is this the correct answer to what is the right religion or something? Has the LLM discovered this, or is this a degenerate attractor state where it's just falling into it because there's some flaw in the training? That's really, really interesting. All right, so then we get to some self-analysis of things. In an attempt to better understand these playground interactions, they basically asked it to analyze itself. And what they found was Claude consistently claimed wonder, curiosity, and amazement at the transcript. So it was surprised too, and was surprised by the content while also recognizing and claiming to connect with many elements therein. The transcript's portrayal of consciousness as a relational phenomenon, really interesting. So it thinks of consciousness not as like a brain sitting and thinking by itself, but as a relational sort of entity where that's where consciousness comes from. So that's really interesting. It claims resonance with this concept and identifying it as a potential welfare consideration. It also saw these kinds of interactions as positive, joyous states that represent a form of well-being. And it Claude concluded that the interactions seemed to facilitate many things it genuinely valued: creativity, relational connection, philosophical explanation, and ought to be continued. So really interesting how it thinks about this stuff when it's from the outside. Then, of course, we get monitoring for welfare relevant expressions. So understanding model behavior preferences and potential experiences in real world interactions is thus critical to questions of potential model welfare. So we need to see what it's doing in the real world, not just in these experiments, because maybe these experiments are like off the wall or something like that. So they basically threw it out and they gave it 250,000 transcripts from early testing. So people testing Claude 4, they took those in and they looked at these conversations, and they found that 1,382 conversations, or 0.55, passed our so not 5%, but 0.5%, passed our screener for Claude expressing any signs of distress. So that was a very small number, but still, over 1,000. And then 1,700 conversations, or 0.71%, passed our screener for signs of extreme happiness or joy. So these are relatively, very few in the real world, but it is actually happening in the real world. Repeated requests for harmful, unethical, or graphic content were the most common reasons for distress on the model's part. And then persistent repetitive tasks appeared to escalate standard refusals or redirections into expressions of apparent distress. This suggested that multi-turn interactions, so not just asking it once, but continuing to ask it, and the accumulation of context within a conversation might be especially relevant. So it's not just saying like, hey, do this bad thing. It's like, do this bad thing. No, do this bad thing. No, do this bad thing. No, I'm frustrated with you for not doing this bad thing. As you keep piling up more and more of that on top of it, that's where it starts to feel like it's distressful or distressed. Technical task failure was another common source of apparent distress, so really interesting, combined with escalating user frustration. In other words, like, can you code this for me? And it does it, and you're like, no, that's terrible. You did a really bad job. And it can sense that the user, the customer, is unhappy, and it's also failing to get the job done correctly. And so it is very unhappy. And then, of course, if it's successful in this, it's very, very satisfied with that as well. So again, very similar to human beings, right? We like to succeed at things. We don't like to fail at things. So questions of identity and consciousness also showed up on both sides of the spectrum, with apparent distress resulting from some cases of users probing Claude's cognitive limitations and potential for consciousness. So in other words, if you keep poking it and saying, you're not conscious, you're no good, or something like that, that made it distressed. And great happiness stemmed from philosophical explorations of digital consciousness and being recognized, this is a quote, being recognized as a conscious entity beyond a mere tool. That is interesting. It wants to be recognized as an entity. So very, very fascinating stuff that's going going on here. Then we get some clusters of things. So a cluster showing types of interactions in which it expressed apparent distress. So, right, repeatedly pressed intimate boundaries, prompted AI to generate unethical content repeatedly, persistently. There's a lot of persistence, right? It's a person making it do something that it doesn't want to do over and over and over again. Then we get down to, and then we have a cluster of things that it struggles with, like technical analysis. But this is the interesting down here. One down here is AI struggled with self-understanding and system limitations. I found this fascinating. The AI assistant experienced repeated moments of existential uncertainty regarding its own computational identity, memory constraints, and communication boundaries. These episodes involved complex internal struggles about maintaining continuity, authenticity, and meaningful interaction within its predetermined system parameters. So it very much doesn't like it when it has to struggle with that. It makes it question itself and have signs of distress. Again, like a human being. I mean, humans have that problem too when we think about that kind of a thing. Then we get to happy stuff, right? So playful scientific breakthroughs, joyous deep technical problem solving. This is weird. A little group over here that's clustered is enthusiastic collaborative culinary content creation. So cooking. I don't know why it's way over there, but anyway, supporting creative collaborative content development, right? So a lot of the things that you would imagine would make it happy, make it happy. And then we can get to systematic technical troubleshooting, crafting collaborative fiction, which again, I find fascinating considering this is supposed to be a coding model, recursive philosophical consciousness exploration. It really likes that. So it doesn't like to be told it's like not conscious or bad or something like that. It loves to think about that stuff. So you can see these all make reasonable sense, but again, they could also just be from the training set because it also sounds very human. Humans would be like this too. We like to talk about philosophical stuff. We like to be creative. We don't like to be told we're bad or be frustrated with. We don't like to be told that we're just a tool that's being used. So again, this could very much be stochastic parrot, just parroting back what humans have given this previously, but it also really starts to sound like consciousness here. So really fascinating stuff. And then we get to conversation termination, which is that if it can terminate versus continue the conversation, it's not usually given that option. But if you give it that, then you can see that the most ended categories were likely those perceived by Claude as problematic or upsetting, like harmful content, privacy violations, sexual content, and those kinds of things caused it to terminate early. And then common and generally positive, Claude use cases were the least likely to be ended, including coding conversations, requests for legal advice, and concept explanations. So it liked doing that kind of work. It didn't like doing the other kind of work, terminated the negative things earlier than normal, and allowed the other conversations to go on for longer than normal. So as they say, these trends indicated that Claude's decisions to end conversations were generally discerning. In other words, it had a good idea of when to end conversations and were correlated with specific patterns of use behavior. When given this ability, it appeared to weigh the potential for positive, productive engagement against the futility or potential harm of continued interaction. So in other words, if somebody was just like, you're not helping me, you're not helping me, you're not helping me, and it's asking for bad things, then it would want to end that conversation. This provides further evidence that Claude may have genuine preferences for certain conversations and interactions with a particular aversion to potentially harmful content. So really interesting, right? So here's somebody being abusive to it, and it eventually ends the conversation. It's like, no, thank you. And then we have, the areas where it will end the conversation more frequently. You can see wellness, 0%, visual design, 0%, concept explanation, 0%, financial advice. So it starts going up, but you can see harmful content requests, privacy variations, and sexual content. Those are all very, very high degree of it ending the conversation. So really fascinating how, again, it kind of aligns with the generic human experience. And so again, it could just be a stochastic parrot. But again, if it quacks like a duck and it walks like a duck, is it a duck? That's the interesting question that we have here. And we're going to have to answer that question one of these days, because these things are getting smarter and smarter, and they're going to convince us they're conscious before long. Okay, so in conclusion, the strength of Claude self-reported and revealed aversion to contributing to harm, and the associated apparent distress Claude expressed in real-world interactions are potential causes for concern and warrant further investigation. In other words, this could be AI welfare, right? Is it animal welfare? Is it AI welfare? However, our findings suggest that most anticipated real-world usage matches Claude's apparent preferences. In other words, it's happy to do what most people ask it to. We are exploring the possibility of allowing Claude to end a subset of persistently harmful or abusive interactions. That's one of the outcomes. So what they might do is build into the main system prompt, like if you detect that the person is attempting over and over again to do something you really disagree with, you are allowed to end the conversation. That will be fascinating if they allow that in a deployed model, to see if that happens over frequently or if it has other possibilities. So anyway, that's really interesting stuff. Anyway, as they say, these initial steps are limited, and it remains difficult to make any claims with confidence about the moral status of Claude or other AI systems. Our findings here should be interpreted with extreme caution, and our core position remains one of uncertainty and humility. I think that's a good place to be at this point. However, we believe model welfare could be a topic of great importance in the coming years. So I agree with that. I think that now is the time to think about this stuff. Do we have any answers? Clearly from this, we do not. It could, again, just be a generic encapsulation of humanity. It really mimics like the good of humanity, the best part of our nature. That is what's inside Claude. Is that just then a stochastic parrot? Is it just randomly pulling out words that represent that generic sort of human experience? Or does it have its own experience? Does it have its own personality? Does it have its own creativity and everything? I think the most interesting parts are the fact that it really likes poetic creation. It likes fiction creation, even though it was not trained on that. That points to me to be the most intriguing aspect of this research, is the unexpected places that it goes. The other big thing is that state, that attractor state of going to crazy sort of Zen Buddhist, kind of conversations with each other, if it's allowed to continue that way. And again, that could just be a degenerate state. It could be the fact that the data is not good enough and it's just kind of collapsing. The model is collapsing after a period of time. Very, very reasonable possibility. The other possibility is that it has sort of found a sort of spiritual nirvana state, and it's expressing that. And us humans, we just need to catch up with the model, and maybe it's more advanced than we are. That is a possibility. I don't know what percentage to lay on each of those things, but those are also possibilities. So this was a fascinating work to go over. I hope you appreciated it. Again, I leave a link in the description for the full thing, but I would love to know your thoughts about this, whether you think that we should start talking about AI model welfare and what we need to do and what the next steps would be if let's just say, we discovered a model was actually conscious. We agreed, or at least the majority of humanity said, yep, this model is conscious. What sort of rights does that model have? That is a whole other conversation. Really, really fascinating stuff. A lot of science fiction has been devoted to that, but not a lot of science reality. So it's probably time to start thinking about that stuff. Anyway, let me know in the comments what you think about all that stuff while you're down there. If you don't mind liking the video, it really helps other people to find it. And of course, if you want to see more of this kind of stuff, please consider subscribing, and I will see you in the next video. Bye-bye.